Welcome to Next in Tech, an S&P Global Market Intelligence podcast where the world of emerging tech lives. I'm your host, Eric Hanselman, Chief Analyst for Technology, Media, and Telecom at S&P Global Market Intelligence. And today, we're going to be revisiting supply chain digitization and a lot of the things that are happening in supply chain technology with a returning guest, Analyst Mark Fontecchio. Mark, welcome back to the podcast.
Hi, Eric. Thanks for having me.
Great to have you back because we'd started a lot of the conversations around digitization, but there were so many things that we didn't cover about aspects of supply chain that we're seeing. And again, we got through the pandemic and everybody's suddenly realizing that supply chain was important. And there is so much more that's going on around it. But there are a lot of aspects that we didn't get into in the first part of this conversation, really talking about what people are doing with a lot of this additional digital data and how that relates to a number of different aspects. And one of the big ones around sustainability. But there's a lot you've been doing in that area.
Yeah, that's true. So generally speaking, sustainability and the problems it addresses is perhaps the most important issue of our time. It goes to our desire or our want to continue to exist on a livable planet. So everyone has seen what's been happening this summer with the record-breaking heat waves across the globe. You have Phoenix, Arizona seeing multiple weeks with record-breaking temperatures. I just saw a story about the water near the Everglades in Florida being recorded at more than 100 degrees. So it's obviously a huge issue right now. And there's a lot of pressure on industry in general to not necessarily reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, although there is some pressure to do that, but just to limit or mitigate the increase. And that pressure is especially high on transportation because transportation is an industry that produces a lot of carbon emissions. According to the EPA, it's the industry that creates the most greenhouse gas emissions. And it's a complex problem to tackle. Somehow, the transportation industry needs to figure out a way to limit their greenhouse gas emissions while also fulfilling that 2-day delivery time desire of consumers to order something online and have it at their doorstep within 2 days.
Right. Get it here fast. But while you're at it, don't burn too much fuel while you're doing it. Make the shortest route possible. All those kinds of things that present some pretty significant challenges.
Yeah. And, when we're talking about supply chain digitization, I mainly focus on what's called downstream supply chain operations. So that's mostly the distribution side. So the shipping and logistics and what sort of technologies are being adopted in the commercial transportation sector. And so we did a survey earlier this year. It's a general survey where we look at all industries and their adoption of technology and IoT technology and projects. And one of the key findings in that kind of segues into some of the interesting results is that, well, first of all, tracking return on investment is important among all industries, but tracking that is even more important in the transportation industry, higher than other industries. And so when you go back to this topic of sustainability, it's for commercial transportation companies, sustainability needs to have profitability riding shotgun in some way. And just to kind of give you an idea of our surveys in the past, the last time we surveyed these commercial transportation companies, we had an option on the survey. We asked them about what projects they're adopting. And one of the options was tracking fuel use or carbon emissions. So it was a combination in that option. And it was the second most popular project. I think it was already adopted by half of the organizations that we surveyed. But you could sort of naturally see there's some murkiness in that answer. How many of those organizations who chose that were tracking fuel use and how many of them were tracking emissions and maybe how many of them were tracking both. So we did something different this time around in the survey that we conducted earlier this year. We provided two options. We separated those two out. And the results are striking. The tracking fuel use was, again, the second most popular project for commercial transportation companies behind fleet management, with I think it was about 63% of organizations were tracking fuel use. Tracking carbon emissions was the least popular project. It was less than 4%. So that gives you an idea of how important it is for these commercial transportation companies to somehow get some kind of ROI from the digital transformation projects that they're adopting and putting into production.
It makes a lot of sense, right? In the days of free 2-day shipping, you've got to manage costs. And if we think about what's probably your one most easily manageable cost, it's going to be the fuel to run the fleets that are actually doing the delivery. You've got a whole set of challenges. You've got assets, as you were identifying, that return on investment capital is a big, big, big concern. You want to make sure that your vehicle fleet is going to be run efficiently, but the thing that that is that day in, day out cost is going to be the fuel piece of that.
Yeah.
Now, hey, the benefit is that if you're reducing fuel costs, you are also probably reducing emissions, hopefully, but that's not that primary focus. Bottom line is the bottom line.
Yeah. As you're saying, I mean, behind labor, fuel is the largest expense for commercial transportation companies. So, yeah, there's no surprise that tracking fuel consumption and aspiring to be more fuel efficient is a primary strategy in the sector. And even some of the other projects that we ask about, how to save more in fuel costs can be seen in some of those other projects. And so, for example, we have an option which is operator monitoring or driver monitoring. And that can be a tool to help drivers operate their vehicles more efficiently. So there are driving strategies which can save fuel, as anyone who's kind of taken a driving course knows, so if you don't brake as hard, if you don't accelerate as hard, then you can save fuel in some way. Especially in the trucking industry, is vehicles idling. So it's pretty common practice in the industry for truckers when they get at a truck stop and they go in to take a break, they leave their vehicle idling. And that doesn't seem like a lot. Say their vehicle is idling 10 minutes every time they take a break. But if you're a trucking company that has a fleet of hundreds of vehicles, and each of those vehicles is idling, say, 20, 30 minutes per trip, then that quickly adds up in terms of fuel costs. So that's one project where it kind of shows up. And then the other one is something around dynamic routing. So that can lead to vehicles being on the road for a shorter amount of time in multiple different ways. It can be aided by sort of near real time and historical data on the right day and time to traverse a route, when there's traffic, when there's construction. But also, it kind of goes back to, we've all heard about this sort of traveling salesman problem. And trucking companies have this same sort of issue where, one of their vehicles delivers a load from point A to point B. And then once they unload it, then they have an empty trailer, and then they need to drive a certain number of miles to go find a load somewhere else. Those are called deadhead miles whenever you're driving around with an empty trailer. And that's just a total waste of fuel. It's an inefficient way to transport goods. And there are ways to use technology in such a way to minimize those deadhead miles so that whenever your truck is actually on the road, it's actually transporting goods. So, yeah, there's a lot of interesting ways to mitigate that.
Well, a lot of that planning is the thing that's helping to figure out how do you manage routing? How do you manage? I mean, now, of course, we see significant issues with labor shortages as well. There aren't enough drivers to be able to move those loads around. So the more efficient you can be with the drivers that you have certainly helps as well. And these are aspects that we think about what the industry is doing to be able to adapt, do better with that. Certainly understanding what you've got, the digitization piece helps you know where are the loads, where are the trucks, what are you actually doing to bring these things together. And the planning piece then hopefully gives you the ability to do that much more efficiently.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a good point about the labor shortage as well. And in the US and Canada, there's strict regulations around how many hours a day a truck driver can be operating the vehicle and how many hours they can be working. So that's another waste. If they're transporting an empty trailer from one spot to another and it takes them an hour to do so, then that's a wasted hour for that labor. So any way to make that more efficient as well is beneficial.
If you can factor in rest breaks along with when a load is ready, when you load up the truck next, when the driver is available, and starting to put all this together in ways that make more sense.
Yeah, and it's just an extremely complex network in terms of if a truck unloads a trailer and then goes to the next location, the next, say, distribution center, and that load isn't ready to be put into the trailer, well, then the truck driver has to wait. So it's not only just a fleet management technology issue on the carrier side with the trucking companies that are transporting the goods, but there needs to be coordination among all the different parties in the downstream supply chain so that everything is kind of coordinated and the least amount of time is wasted and therefore the least amount of energy and fuel is wasted as well. I think that's where it kind of becomes very complex with all of these organizations in different areas of the supply chain needing to figure out a way to work with each other to make the supply chain as efficient as possible.
Well, I mean, we saw all of the stories through these horror shows of supply chain disruptions. Ships backed up in ports, trucks backed up and waiting to go get containers out of the ports, rail terminuses, pick your particular scenario. All these things where there was this mismatch of the flow, the capacity, the ability to be able to deal with this. And now to a point at which we're not in quite that same kind of extreme levels of problems, but we've still got to tackle what are some fairly complicated issues in scheduling. And as we seem to do in just about every episode these days, that brings up the subject of artificial intelligence and some of the pieces that can help to manage this. Is generative AI going to solve all of these problems too?
Yeah, it is interesting. Every sort of conference or meeting that I've gone to, or any sort of conversation I have with clients or vendors over the last 6 months plus, it's inevitable that generative AI comes up. Everyone talks about Chat GPT and everything like that.
All we need is for freighters to start using ChatGPT and life will be great. Just sprinkle a little generative AI pixie dust on it and we'll be in business.
Yeah, and I'm sure my colleague Nick Patience, he went into a lot more detail in terms of the requirements to make that work, in terms of having the right data sets. And it's just like anything else, generative AI in shipping and logistics and commercial transportation and supply chain is only going to work if the data coming in is good and accurate. But yeah, I think there are some areas of potential in this space. I think companies in shipping and logistics and supply chain are maybe a bit trigger shy right now, though. They feel like they got burned a bit with the hype around blockchain. A few years ago, there was a lot of talk then about how blockchain would enable sort of the transfer of shipment information very easily across all parties who wanted it. And there were a lot of collaborations that happened, but nothing has really come to fruition on that side of things. So,
Well, it's that thing that I think we run across so often, particularly in our conversations we've had previously about the state of the industry today, is that it's not all that digitized. And in many cases, for reasons that are going to be hard to overcome, which is that you're moving information back and forth between the various parties in ways that is still pretty basic, but it is that lowest common denominator to ensure that everybody knows that you can actually get the information successfully. And taking that all the way down to faxing information back and forth because it's what you know is going to work. And hey, if that's going to work, it's reliable. And of course, in an environment in which there are already pressures to get it done, to make sure that whatever that situation is happens, suddenly converting all of this over to a blockchain based environment means that you're going to have to disrupt the system that's working. And you get into those sort of chicken and egg problems of, is this going to make it sufficiently better in an area in which we're already concerned about capital spend? Who has the money to do that? All the typical technology transition problems we see in any major shift.
yeah, and when it comes to data in particular, this is probably across on other industries, but we definitely see it in supply chain and transportation, is that one of the challenges to digital transformation, one of the biggest challenges is integration. And so it's not just about whether the data is good, but it's also about whether the data is available to all and how it's being harmonized in how it's actually being used and who has access to that data, who owns the data, because it's such a complex network that if all the parties don't have buy-in, then you're going to end up with just a lot of holes in, say, supply chain visibility, because an ocean shipper doesn't want to share the data that they have with other parties. And so you see that in this industry right now. So there's like a ton of potential for generative AI in supply chain and shipping and logistics, but it requires so much integration from a lot of parties that have spent decades maybe not used to sharing their data with other parties because it gives them some sort of competitive advantage. So it can be difficult to get to that point where everyone is a little bit more open about sharing their data.
Well, it's that question of if you know that you've got capacity, but yet you don't want to discount your rates. Do you want your competitors knowing that you've got a lot of capacity to move and might have incentives to discount? And it starts getting into all of those issues about, hey, it's wonderful and lovely to put everything into a publicly available resource like a blockchain or pick your particular environment, but you've got to ensure that proprietary data, the data value, gets respected in the way in which the systems get built. You wind up having to craft not just something that's an open marketplace for data, but something that actually is a marketplace that each of the various participants can still maintain their proprietary interests and yet transact business. And as you pointed out, that means you got to get a lot of people agreeing about a lot of perspectives on how they're going to put this together in order to make it really work.
Yeah, and agreeing in theory is a lot different than in practice.
Yes, indeed.
To your point, it's about what do those revenue sharing agreements look like? We just recently, earlier this year, did a major consulting project, where we looked at multi-access edge computing in the consumer auto space. And we looked at a lot of, vehicle to everything use cases. And it was the same sort of issue, like where is this data going to be hosted? Who has access to that data? And then any sort of revenue that's being generated by these projects, like on the consumer auto side, like say it's something around smart parking or something like that, who receives share of that revenue from that particular project. And so, like you said, it becomes very complex in reality to kind of figure out how to share the data and who gets the benefit from it. But yeah, in generative AI, I think there is some opportunity there. Given that one of the biggest challenges right now is around labor and skills shortages for commercial transportation and supply chain, the right industry specific data model could provide a lot of value in the supply chain around procuring those freight loads. It could be extremely beneficial to fleet managers determining the best route of travel, monitoring the freight on its journey, and so on. So there's definitely a lot of potential there, but I'm not sure how long it's going to take to be accepted and adopted in the shipping and logistics industry, commercial transportation organizations, and in the supply chain.
Well, it sounds like something where, if you can get into a situation in which individual route planning can get done for specific companies and to be able to be smarter about how that gets done, to do this in ways that can be adopted individually. And maybe that's something that part of that starts to get to a situation where it's generating enough data that you have the data in place that you can potentially share. But you've got to get up that slope first of actually making sure that you've actually got the data to be able to make that happen and have an understanding about how that transformation is actually going to get worked. Because in order to know routes, you have to have digitized what it is you're actually delivering, the information about where your fleet happens to be, condition of drivers, all those kinds of things. And that's still early days in terms of marching up that slope for most of the participants in the logistics industry. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we're seeing some progress in that area. And so this is going to kind of go back to our earlier discussion of sustainability a little bit, but you're seeing a lot of vendors out there now that are really trying to develop comprehensive platforms for I would say the overall umbrella would be fleet management. And there are a lot of different apps and features that exist under that umbrella. And one of those is, say, route optimization, and another is operator monitoring. Those are big ones in terms of these organizations, vendors like, say, Samsara and Motive that have dash cams that can be installed on a truck and monitor the driver. Both they can monitor the road and they can monitor the driver. And then they can pull in a lot of data there. They might pull in some third party data around traffic and road conditions and put it all together and then give fleet managers a lot of information actually about how their fleet is operating and how their drivers are operating their vehicles and what might be the best route and what vehicles might be the most energy efficient or what vehicles might benefit the most or what vehicle routes might benefit the most from a vehicle transitioning to electric as companies start to look toward doing that, at least on a mixed fleet basis. So there are some vendors out there, and I would say a lot of them are really trying to kind of give that comprehensive view to fleet managers so that they don't have to sort of pick and choose applications here and software here and there and try to put it all together themselves.
Yeah, which really sort of brings us back full circle to those fundamental issues around sustainability being driven by a push to optimize and drive for efficiency. Interesting. Well, what should organizations be thinking about as they start looking towards this? I mean, the traveling salesman problem, that's something that quantum computing is going to solve for us down the road, right?
Oh yeah, that's another topic du jour, quantum computing. Yeah. Yeah, I think organizations should look toward, at least in commercial transportation, kind of look toward doing what they've always been doing, which is figuring out a way to generate revenue and save money. And if they can do that through digitization, commercial transportation companies are particularly focused on reducing their fuel costs. And if they do that, then sustainability and reducing their carbon emissions will just kind of go hand in hand with that. So I know some listeners might think that when I kind of separate, and when I talk about how we separated the options out and so few of them are dedicated to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, or at least that's not one of the projects they're adopting, it might be thought of as a bad thing, but it's actually not, because so many of them are so highly focused on reducing fuel use that sustainability and that emissions piece just comes along as a rider naturally. And so if they can just focus on that side of things, at least in the near term, they're going to be in good shape. And what organizations, probably commercial transportation in particular organizations, and say the trucking space, need to be thinking about today is looking at which vehicles and which routes in their fleets perhaps can transition eventually to electric vehicles. And so there are some options out there, even for long haul kind of class 8 trucks, where there are EVs there. And, talked about this a lot before, but those routes that are going to be back to base operations where a vehicle, so you're not talking about long haul, you're not talking about a cross country trip that's 3,000 miles and takes multiple days, but you're talking about a truck that picks up a load at the port and brings it to a nearby distribution center and then parks where it started at the beginning of the day and can charge where they have EV chargers located. Those sorts of things organizations should start thinking about today for their sort of medium and long-term aspirations in terms of not only reducing their carbon emissions, but also becoming more energy efficient, using less fuel, and their fleets becoming a little bit more electrified than they are now.
It's those planning tools that'll help them get there. Well, as I said, it's technology transitions are never simple, but especially when there's a strong motivation like this that, fortunately enough, also happens to help the planet. It's one of those things that gets them moving forward. So a good thing in both ways around, as you said.
Yeah, it is that dual benefit to the bottom line, but also kind of circling back to the beginning, just, helping to continue to make this a livable planet and address those concerns around the issues that we've been having with, those sort of record breaking heat waves and the issues of sustainability and reducing carbon emissions.
Hey, motivations that should be more than enough by themselves. So one of those things that hopefully we can get this whole transition moving forward very quickly. Well, Mark, this has been great. Thanks for coming back to extend the discussion on this.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Eric. It's been a good discussion as always.
Well, great to have you here. And that is it for this episode of Next in Tech. Thanks to our audience for staying with us. And thanks to our production team, including Carolyn Wright, Ethan Simon on the marketing and events teams, and our agency partner, the 199. I hope you'll join us for our next episode, where we'll actually be talking about things that touch on some of the aspects underpinning all this. We'll be looking at advances in semiconductors, a lot of the next stage of what's taking place in high-performance compute, and maybe touch a little bit on the quantum pieces we were kicking around. I hope you'll join us then, because there is always something next in tech.